I think Aaron's favorite saying is an embarrassment of riches, and assuming that everybody here is a fan and a supporter of the museum, the work that you've done has really created an embarrassment of riches. I'm Mark Hanna. I'm with EVB, and many of you have heard this, but 7 years ago, I was a fan of the museum. I was a fan of the work that Aaron was doing. And I said, Aaron, how can we partner? How can we do something? I love the lectures. I love the gallery openings. And he thought about it for a few months. And he finally came to me and he said, we're bringing a gentleman here for a distinguished scholar in residence. We think he'll be here a year. His name's John Spike. We're going to try and do like 3 lectures a semester.
This has never come out before.
Would you be interested? And we did that. And the first few, we've had lectures here, and there might be 50. We would wait till 6:15, sometimes 6:20 to get started, to try and make sure that we had as many people as were coming. Now, if you don't have a seat by quarter till, you're probably shut out, as you all know, because you're here in seats. But I just want to say we're proud to be associated with this. We're a community bank. We're committed to the local community. We're committed to William and Mary. We're committed to the Muscarelle. It's been a great partnership, as you can tell. And we're just thrilled to hitch our wagons to the great work that Aaron and Dr. Spike are doing. If you have any financial needs, I hope you'll consider EVB. If you're somebody that's not currently giving to the Muscarelle, I hope you'll consider making a gift. This is great for the community. It's great to put us on the map. As a lover of art, I'm just proud of the great work that's being done here. So with that, I'll give you the man that really needs no introduction, but John Spike.
Let's call for some welcoming comments from our director, Aaron DeGrom. You underestimate my powers.
I'm sorry, every third Thursday, I'm on the founding board of the Williamsburg James City County Schools Foundation. I'm always running over there and running back in time and whatever. But we thought the theme of the lecture today would be heat it up. I think they said it's about 90 degrees in this room, so I'm sorry about that. Because of this embarrassment of riches, we have had to go to yet another venue that can see people, and the museum is full. And I guess there's no microphone.
No, I'm wired.
Oh, you are? Good. Because they're all worried that what they're going to be freaking out over there is because the people watching the screen aren't going to be able to hear me. So that's fine. As long as they can hear John, that's fine with me, because that's all they care about is when the lecture starts that they can hear John over there. So thank you all for coming. I think it is really crazy. How many people came to the topics in architecture on Tuesday night? So yeah, it was a good crowd, and actually another 434 people were watching online. So that's interesting that a number of our staff and the collections management have really pushed us over the years to now it's being streamed out on Facebook Live. So you can watch it live, you can keep it, you can watch it later, and you can track all that. And so we're really happy about that. I think tonight we'll probably have a record number. And so thank you all for coming. They also have the reception. The EVB reception is over there. That once they move the chairs out, it's all set up. So we'd love to have you all over there. I want to thank Mark Hanna and EVB as usual. In fact, usually we have a slide. But when the email went out, obviously their logo's on there, and we really appreciate their underwriting of this program now for many years, as well as providing the reception afterwards. And so thank Mark and his staff for what they're doing, because otherwise we may not be able to do it in this way. So we just had an embarrassment of riches with the Botticelli exhibition. We're ahead of where we are for Leonardo. Unfortunately, all the softcover books, even the signed ones, are all sold out. Half the hardcovers are sold out, and there will not be any more. It's not the same deal as when you print 50,000 books and you pull them out of your distribution warehouse. This is basically a high-end boutique book, and if you think you're going to get one somehow from Boston, I wouldn't count on that. Actually, this fellow came by the museum the other day, and he bought a couple of books, and he was asking Mary Grace, yeah, I've seen some Muscarelle books online, on Amazon.com, and they're crazy. Like, here's this one by this woman, Michelle Spike, on Matilda Canosa. It's $145. And she goes, well, I can say one for $39.95, right? So the Leonardo book was like $400 because they're just so rare in their run. So thank you all so much. Thank EBB. Thank John, because the exhibition is just constantly blowing everybody's mind. The tours are going up and up and up in terms of every night, every weekend. And I'm not going to complain, but it is an embarrassment of riches for which we could not do it without your support and help. So give yourselves a round of applause and thank you.
Let's see how the sound is. Sounds pretty good to me. How about you? Hopefully it's going through to the museum. I understand that in the live Facebook streaming, my voice is being dubbed out by Latvian translation. I hope it's enjoyable the same. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the artists who impacted on the two great artists in our exhibition, Sandro Botticelli and his great master, Fra Filippo Lippi, and I'll even make some comments about Florence in general, the character, Florentine art, and maybe touch even on why Florence. So here is Florence from the air, and although they never had a chance to see it this way, they were keenly aware and historically very proud, the Florentines, that the center of their city was still the original Roman grid. And they attributed to the preservation of this perfect geometric rectangle here with all those right angles, they attributed to it their very superior sense of order. We all keep track of our birthdays because in Florence in the 1200s, it was necessary to know your birthday so that you could pay your proper tax. Isn't that amazing? It's the start of everything. At any rate, the Florentines were the first people to keep such records, and the Florentine archives still today are treasure troves of historical information. This idea continued through the Middle Ages, right up to the time we're talking about, the 1400s, the Renaissance, and I show you two very ancient manuscripts, and one on the left shows God, who looks a lot like his son, inverting the usual process. He is an architect with a compass, and he's designing the world, and here what he's got there is the land and the sea. And the basis of this is something from the Book of Wisdom, a statement that St. Augustine repeated at least 3 times to my knowledge. God created the world in order, measure, and number. Because of that authoritative statement, the Renaissance took it for granted that the secret underlying plan of creation, that which wasn't readily visible to the eye, but they would replicate it in their architecture, was Euclidean geometry. And that is why when we go and we look at the Renaissance buildings, and if we read up about it, it says a circle can be perfectly inscribed in this square and so forth. They are recovering God's original plan. And that is one of the reasons for their excitement and what they're doing, and the intensity and drive they had always to do the very best they could, because they felt the stakes were that high. It was an enviable position for an artist to be in. And right, the visionary in many, many fields, including music, Hildegard von Bingen, in one of her manuscripts, it's illustrated by this idea that prefigures the Renaissance idea that man is the measure of all things, because creation is wrapped around him. These meant a lot to Florentine artists of the Renaissance, and bear it in mind. On the bell tower, which is designed by Giotto, the great artist, they have in the lowest level, where you see all those rectangles, these lozenges, as they're called, and they show all the qualities and categories of human knowledge and endeavor, and Euclid is portrayed there. And notice he's got the compass to draw perfect circles and other figures, and his whole studio here is rather cubistic, and this was taken under advice by everyone. So even in the Middle Ages, here we are in the 1300s, they sought order in their compositions. They just had a different style, and at this point it's one imported from France, Gothic style, which means wild and uncouth, by the way, of or pertaining to the Goths. We don't have any Goths here tonight, I hope. And so right there they all are, the liberal arts, the sacred virtues, the doctors of the church, and in the center, on the throne, is Thomas Aquinas. This is from the Church of Santa Maria Novella, a Dominican church, and he is the great doctor of the church who was a Dominican, and they laid them all out. This is basically, by the way, an Aristotelian approach to the world. It's like an encyclopedia. Everything has its niche. The driving force in Renaissance thinking in Florence, under the influence of the court of Lorenzo de' Medici il Magnifico, was the counter-trending philosophy of Aristotle's master, Plato. Plato thought that the deepest truths were communicated through visions, dreams, allegories, parables, and that dreamy poetry, that dreamy poetic quality is something that, at the peak of his closeness to the Medici artistic philosophy, Botticelli sought to make otherworldly, dreamily, divinely beautiful things. Yes, even that. That was surely worth 25 minutes of my time. Now, this is what Florence is really like. This is a map of the later 1400s, and it's not, when you're in the streets of this town, you're not so aware of all the grid-like specialties. And grids connect in all very neat ways, and the avenues seem straight. But when you're in the city, you have difficulty tracing a straight line. Yet that is what we tried to do in our Botticelli show. We only showed the straight line of his works, and today I'm going to get into some of the side streets. And where he lived is a roundabout, a small narrow street, where you see right in the center, Via del Porcellana, the house of Botticelli. There's no plaque on his house. I was thinking of fixing that this summer when I'm back in Florence. I know just the people to talk to. And we should have, Michelangelo has a wonderful plaque. In this house, imagined and drew great things. Michelangelo will say what Botticelli did. It's probably the fault of the street he lived in, because it means the street of the sloppy fat person. Coming not from the word for porcelain, which is that lovely ceramic, but from porco, pig. Santa Maria Novella, I showed you that fresco a moment ago, and just across the street, not yet visible, is the train station that you come into. And in his neighborhood was a church of Ognissanti, and we're excited and privileged to have in the exhibition this fresco by Botticelli, which is still in the church of Ognissanti of St. Augustine, but it is portable because it was removed from the wall in the mid-1500s. So here's his street. I thought, going right to this source, there's nothing on it. It's a rather nondescript street, but always seeking to make myself helpful. It's two of the best and most genuine trattorie, small restaurants in the city. And they're called the Trattoria Sostanza, lower left, and that's the inside. See how small it is? So if you show up and call that day, they will look at the thumb incredulously because the tables are all taken already. You have to think a few days ahead. Upper right, Trattoria dei 13 Gobi, the Trattoria of the 13 Dwarves. I've never seen them there, but that restaurant, it goes on forever in the interior building, and it almost always has a table. And here is what Tuscan food looks like. It's very, very simple, flinty like their beloved stones. Not all cities could be built, everything made of stone. That's tortellini in brodo, in chicken broth. Well, our story really begins in 1422 with the beginning of the short, painfully short career of Masaccio, who was the first Renaissance painter, and he was the master of Botticelli's master, Filippo Lippi. Any study of Italian painting requires that you pay attention to the artist you're thinking about, to their master, and the master before them, because they are very close inheritances, master to master. Now, for 1422, until you really know how to read the scorebook, you might not think this is so modern, but actually it was exaggeratedly modern for an artist who was about 20 at the time. This work was only rediscovered in 1961. Imagine a Masaccio that went all the centuries unrecognized, and probably today it wouldn't be recognized as Masaccio, except he dated it. He even said the 20th of April, 1422. Invaluable, because no one else alive could have done the things that he does. In this painting, the San Giovanale triptych, still out in the countryside in this very small town on the road towards Arezzo. This is what Florentine art, the best Florentine art, looked like in 1422. There was a great painter, very medieval painter, named Don Lorenzo Monaco. This is the Magi. You see, everybody looks like they just came home from a costume party. They are dressed in completely unrealistic, fancifully colored and pointed clothes, because the idea was they're participating in very important events. They shouldn't look like the chap next door. So we look at the Masaccio next to it to see the difference. Also, something that's, two things are very different right off the bat, if not three. The angels, we don't see their faces. They're these difficult. This is considered more realistic, that we see people from the back. Mostly, we don't see important people in the front playing from the back. The child looks like he's based on a Roman bronze. That's a new idea. But this is, of course, the beginning of the Renaissance. They want to be more natural, and they have lots and lots of examples of very natural art. It just happened to be, 1,000 years old, 1,000 or 1,500 years old, and that was classical art that was lying around. And also, look at the care he took to make this throne look really three-dimensional and something you could wrap around. He's not very adept at it yet. The step goes straight down in front of him. He couldn't figure out how to do that. But compared to the architecture, a lovely pink in the Lorenzo Monaco. Well, seemingly everything should have changed forever and ever when, just a year later, a very, very important patron of art, whose name was Strozzi, Paolo Strozzi, a humanist, hired this wonderful painter recently in Venice. This is Venetian style. The painter is from Fabriano, which is in the zone called the Marches to the east of Tuscany, and he came in, and has anyone here, just polling the group, ever received a Christmas card? If so, this was probably the picture on it. There's no picture more often reproduced on Christmas cards than this wonderful painting in the Uffizi. And, it's a great event. The Magi arrive, and they're, decked out to the hilt. It's lively, it's appealing. This is considered the absolute masterpiece of the style that had been prevailing for about 100 years, which they called International Gothic, because every country was doing forms of this. Quite remarkably, Florence was so intent on following a different direction, this had no impact on the local school. This artist, who is from Tuscany, in fact, his birthplace, Panicale, is not far from where Masaccio was born, but he was a few years older. Masolino. Masolino means little Thomas, and Masaccio means big, a little ugly Thomas. I mean, names are so significant, that's why my name is Spike. But why? Masolino, this is a wonderful painting in Rome, Washington National Gallery. He is thinking about putting everything in order, a new form of architecture without those Gothic pinnacles, and everything is calmed down and simplified compared to the jumble, the exhilaratingly decorative jumble of Gentile da Fabriano. I mean, this is a lovely painting. They had no reason to change direction. But they were insistent, these two, and they were also being advised by the first Renaissance architect, Brunelleschi, who is at this moment deep into his work on the building the cupola of the cathedral, and Donatello, the great sculptor, and that is why Roman sculpture keeps on getting referenced in these works of Masaccio. This is rather a wonderful piece that was finally understood for the first time by the great art critic Roberto Longhi, when he pointed out what parts were by Masaccio and what parts were by Masolino. The Madonna and the Child are by Masaccio. All the rest, Saint Anne behind Lady, and the angels are all by Masolino, with one exception. One of them is by Masaccio, and this one angel by him, is interesting, lively, vivacious, as opposed to dull as dishwater by Masolino. And I think you can see the chap in green, who is the single angel by Masaccio. And Longhi pointed this all out rather wonderfully. And there are known Roman bronzes of this pose of the child. They didn't trust themselves yet to really, plus babies crawl around, they learn to roll over, and it's hard to really capture them. So why not get a Roman bronze, put a baby head on it? There's an artist who's born around 1395, and he's going to be, unfortunately, pretty much the bane as rival of Filippo Lippi. He is named Frangelico. He's about 10 years older. He immediately reacts to what Masaccio and Masolino do. That painting was in the church, and it was like new records by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. People raced to listen to them when they came out. I know this is lost on the junior set, but the rest of us recall it. So it was with these new avant-garde paintings when they came out. And here is Frangelico's, 1426. And putting it together with the other one, we notice, goodness, there are quite a few similarities in the pose and drapery of the Madonna. The Child in Frangelico is much more traditional. It's rather old-fashioned. gown on the Christ child, not this idea of trying to sneak in antiquity. And here's the thing, they are both thinking about the first great artist who starts bringing the Middle Ages and painting to a close. That's a century before Giotto. And probably Fra Angelico sees what Masaccio is doing there and looks also for himself, because this painting by Giotto and Wright was in the church of Ognissanti, the church where Botticelli would have 50 years his painting, and he was much more lifelike than anyone had been. Now here's a little note, nota bene, all dates are approximate. I have to put this in, especially for people who watched the movie on our website of the talk tonight, or watching it now. Art historians could be going through apoplectic fits because I don't write 24-25 all the time and so forth. But I was drilled by an excellent physical science teacher in high school into the concept of significant numbers. And honestly, because all of these are guesses, as 1424 to 26 is a guess, all these things, we might as well just keep the guess simple for our purposes tonight. In 1426, Masaccio and Masolino were given an extraordinary opportunity from a man named Felice Brancacci to paint these frescoes, the life of St. Peter and all the stories in this chapel in the Carmine Church. And they certainly didn't waste their opportunity. This, of course, is the subject of many books, and I even have a lecture just about one aspect of this chapel. But for our purposes, it's of fundamental importance because a friar in this church, Carmelite church, was the 20-year-old Fra Filippo Lippi. And he was captivated by Masaccio, who was 5 years older than he. They became pals. And Fra Filippo decided he was going to dedicate himself to a career as a painter. What a way to start, right at the top monument. Felice Brancacci, his name means happy, Brancacci, but actually just within a few years it was discovered he was a terrible embezzler. And was exiled from the city, and they tore up a lot of the frescoes on the lower register. They call that because they had portraits of Felice's friends and himself. And that's a little sad that they tore up frescoes by Masaccio and Masolino. Curiously, this is in 1480. What did they do? They hired this son of Filippo Lippi, who was the pupil of Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, this is 60 years later, to paint the replacement frescoes on the ground floor. Here is, so you see, this is so well organized, measure, order, weight. See Filippino Lippi right next to the row he painted, and Masolino right next to his painting of Adam and Eve, and then the other painting from the book of Acts, St. Peter, visiting and healing people. All the way at the extreme left, I didn't have space to stick it in. Those last ones, there's a baptism above a preaching scene. They were both by Masaccio. That's the right-hand wall. So we see these lives of Peter, and rather unexpectedly, Adam and Eve have dropped in. Like a television sitcom. Friends drop in a kind of suspicious way. What do they really want? Well, here they are, expelled from the garden, first thing upper left, and then we go back to the story of St. Peter. Well, this has perplexed people a long time, although it shouldn't have, really, and we'll get into that, what it means. Upper left, we see the whole view again, and above the window, there's a lot of squirrely little figures. I'm trying to learn the local Virginian cadence. Squirrely was one of the first words I learned here. With these squirrely little figures that are from the 1700s. they tore out the original vault and lunettes, which had been painted by Mazzolino. So we see this, it looks like a big X. That's from a different church. But what he painted up there had 1, 2, 3, 4 evangelists in those 4 sections. And then you see we have this graphic of the subjects. The calling of St. Peter's was in one of the lunettes that came up for the point. And we see, fortunately, survives a copy of what his story was there, the calling of Saints Peter and Andrew by the seashore. Well, no one could ever figure out what the scheme, what was the plan behind these things, because no one thought to take into account the parts thrown away. Interesting, when things don't exist, we don't, let's pay no attention. But in fact, it didn't take much thought. Once you examined what was missing and what was in the top, they had made a wonderful order of the opening verses and chapters of Genesis, because the evangelists in the vault are the Word. And then we had 2 scenes, Christ walking on the water was the other one, of sea and land separated. And then below, where we get to the part that's still preserved, there were mountains and cities. So it showed all the days of creation in Genesis. And that, of course, is quite a tip-off, because who else is in the book of Genesis? Adam and his bride Eve. What were they up to? Well, it started out great. You may recall the story. And then there was that mix-up about which fruit you could eat or not. And that had immense consequences. Then they knew the difference between good and evil, and they were expelled from the garden. And I wonder if I have a picture of that. And that is why Christ had to come back to redeem us from that scene. And that is why Adam and Eve are there. And in fact, the story of St. Peter, in the way it's told, is told as a sort of parallel to the life of Christ. And so the whole thing is one very carefully thought out program that, because it isn't linear according to the scripture, it is what they were starting to talk about. It's poetic, putting together things that don't belong to the linear story, but when they're together, they tell more about each other. That's what poetry is for, as opposed to narrative. It's interesting what the artist did. Before the fall, Mazzolino had this sleek style, everyone's feeling good. He did the Adam and Eve on the right. Afterwards, what a fall there was. There the angel angrily forcing them out of the garden, and now they walk among us. It was obviously a serious event. Notice, therefore, and the reason I show you these, 2 tendencies come out. There's the tendency of looking at life in Masaccio. Filippo Lippi does that. But there's the other tendency that things that are divine and unspoiled, as we were in the garden, need refinement, need to be idealized. And both Filippo Lippi and his pupil Botticelli will combine these elements. Neither is a pure naturalist, neither is a pure idealist, as Mazzolino was. I jumped ahead to that. I want to show you these things. Other ideas of how much is in these things. The lowest scene is the tribute money. And when he did this, there's in the center, Christ tells St. Peter, because the impertinent young man in the orangish tunic there is saying, aren't you going to pay the tax? Christ says to Peter, go and take that fish, and in the mouth you'll find that coin. They give it to him, and this is where render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Brancacci was embezzling from the tax department, so he actually had a keen interest in making sure everyone paid their taxes. We didn't realize it was a personal interest at the time. At far right, St. Peter is handing the coin over to this young man, whose position is right off of Trajan's column, right out of classical Roman art. And for doing a serious story from antiquity, they looked at how, at upper left, this is a mosaic of about the year 350 in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore. Line of figures in the front plane means something serious and classical is happening. And in between, look how close Giotto got to this in around 1310, the previous century, and he's expelling Christ, he's expelling the money changers from the temple. Notice the architecture of Masaccio isn't really developed past the architecture in Giotto, but there's a perspective to the Masaccio that he didn't know about. And here it is, tracing those lines. All the orthogonals, we're called, the things that go into depth, go right to the source of creation, right to Christ. This is a way of a secret geometry, because if everything depends on that one vanishing point, him, that is a way of saying he is the creator of all. Now Masolino, sort of heard the lesson, but he has his fall into a meaningless place, kind of in the center. And that's how you go down in history, and no one here knew his name before. Now this I want to show, it's rather wonderful. He invented things that nobody used till the 1800s. Here is a street, St. Peter's, walking down the street, and it has these sharp perspective lines that all go back to that temple in the back, and there's beggars lined up, because the story is told that when Peter's shadow fell over the cripples, they were healed. So he's got a stop-action movie of the chap who's standing with his hands together, was kneeling before. In the middle, the bald-headed man is rising, and the other chap looking up hasn't had his shadow yet. So it's unfolding cinematic style action, and people are too far ahead of everyone to even be used. Well, we have this wonderful early, about 1429 or 30, Filippo Lippi in the exhibition. And I show you the work was in Pisa at the Carmelite Church, where Masaccio, again, and he was accompanied and assisted on this by Filippo Lippi. If we look at the angel heads, especially, and the head of the infant Christ, we see where the baby-ish angel heads of Filippo Lippi came from, and there are attempts to make them more natural. And here's the saint in that same altarpiece where we just saw the detail of the big Madonna, the one that's by Filippo Lippi, the other one that's by Masaccio. I showed this in my previous lecture, but because it's my discovery, I don't tire of it. Now, what did other people do? How did other people respond to this? Well, it's interesting to see how the numero uno, Fra Angelico, responded to it. Well, two things. Here we have the story of the Annunciation, and very, very unusually, there, way in the distance upper left, there's Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. He put into a single picture this idea that one action and reaction is the Annunciation, the Redemption. This row of columns, we saw something similar in Masolino's scene there. I didn't point it out. I won't go back for it. It's a Masolino idea of these receding loggia, round arched tops. So he immediately responds to it, and he keeps it up. A few years later, his command of his figure style is absolute. And look at that wonderful perspective on the bench in the distant chamber there. It's really showing it off. The grass outside the loggia there, where Mary lives, a rather lovely house, That is sprinkled with little wild flowers, and that is traditionally what the ground looked like in images of Eden. So they're being kicked out of Eden, but the redemption is our ticket back to the garden. Let that be your motto for the evening. We've got to get back to the garden. Here, I've accidentally left a Filippo Lippi slide stuck on top of this painting here. There it is. And Filippo doesn't have the clarity of Fra Angelico. He just can't bring himself to break away. From the early one we saw, there's always a crowd of people, and the Medici prefer the simpler, more classical seeming work of Angelico. This is like his masterpiece of this style. There's been a book written in the previous 5 years by Leon Battista Alberti, who says the way to make a picture is you make a ground plan, and he's describing a stage, and then you position everybody on it, and he doesn't say it, but it's like pieces of chess. And in fact, and these are the two Medici saints, Cosmas and Damien. They were doctors, doctor brothers. I didn't mean Joyce, brother doctors. And the Italian word for doctors is Medici. So they're there, and he took this symmetry to such an extent that if you imagine the center of it right on a line with the upright beam of the cross, folding it up, you see, oh, it's perfect symmetry. Even though they're facing in different directions, the position of all those halos, they all touch perfectly. It's a perfect bilateral symmetry because everything should be in good order. We're in the mid-40s, and a very influential picture on the new idea coming from Alberti is made by this artist who didn't live very long. I don't have any evidence that Filippo Lippi knew him particularly, but people love the idealism of this view of paradise as a kind of palatial palace. This was the first important, finally, he got a job from Cosimo de' Medici. And it was to make an altarpiece for the chapel used by the Franciscan novices and the new candidates for the priesthood in the church of Santa Croce. And look how he got his act in order here. I mean, it's as though a friend of his drew that background and said, just put 2 figures, not 3, in front of every one, you'll be okay. And it was evidently successful because he began to get regular jobs from the Medici. And here is a curious case where the painting was started by Fra Angelico, left unfinished, and it was finished some years later, not many though, 5 to 10, by Fra Angelico. I think I left out. Well, here in this picture, only the Madonna and Child by Fra Angelico, the 2 bearded chaps are quite typical Filippo Lippi. And also over on the left-hand side, mingled in those kneeling angels, I suppose, some are by Fra Filippo, some are by Fra Angelico. So this picture has stymied art historians, which I think does them a world of good. To take pause. This is all very difficult, actually. It all occurred centuries ago, because many experts said this is only by Fra Angelico because it was in the possession of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who said in his inventory, this is my most valuable painting. That is from the evaluation put on it. It's worth twice as much as any other painting he owned, and they said this is by Fra Angelico. But modern critics of Fra Filippo Lippi thought it was entirely by him. And then a very, very clever art historian named Miklos Boskowitz, a man whom I had the privilege of knowing, figured it out, figure by figure, and it's completely plausible how he did it. The round shape became popular around this time because round is a perfect form. It's a divine form because it's endless, it's unified, it's unitarian. And Fra Filippo Lippi, he's matured a lot, he's got more capabilities. And we see here, I don't know, look at that, just turn it, moves. This woman who is carrying something on her head will be the delight and joy of Sandro Botticelli. That's and the facial type of this Madonna will be absorbed by Botticelli, but not for some time because he's only 7 years old when this painting is made. And in fact, it is interesting to see how the first generation die off, and new generation for the third quarter, where our artist is going to be. Masaccio has already died in 28, and then we have Botticelli is born at the same time as the death of Brunelleschi. Then along come the people of his age, Ghirlandaio. You see that he is 6 years older than Leonardo da Vinci, and there are lots of things in common between him and Leonardo da Vinci. For Angelico will pass away. Filippino Lippi is the son of Filippo Lippi, who died. He's not on the chart because he was born in 1405. Donatello Lippi dies, birth of Michelangelo Buonarroti. He comes back in this lecture because he was 30 years younger than Botticelli, and for that reason they could be friends. Anyone near in age to Michelangelo he loathed by definition. 1459, Filippo gets his most important commission ever from the Medici. He's asked to make the altarpiece in the new, lavish, private chapel in the Medici Palace, and it's been given to him to do. And you see, he couldn't have gotten much closer to Fra Angelico, so eager that this should work. Even the slender facial type of Mary is rather like Fra Angelico. Baby has the usual experience. And then in his other ways, his irresistible fantasy, over on the left-hand side, there's the young John the Baptist looking lost in this forest, why a forest, and there's St. Bernard hovering there in some weird way, and above we have God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and so they make the Trinity. And this was a great success for him, and it's only a bizarre and regrettable accident of history that it is not still in the chapel. This is a copy that they have there, but under Napoleon, when Napoleon took over Italy, the first decade of the 1800s, sold the painting to some chap named Sali. I mean, it gets worse and worse this time. And Sali's got this picture and takes it back to Paris, and ultimately it is acquired for the Royal Collection in Germany. And there it is in the Berlin Museum. The side walls here were given to the best pupil of Fra Angelico, whose name was Botticelli. If there are avid jigsaw puzzle addicts in the group, you have very likely done a jigsaw puzzle of this wonderful. The rocks are very confusing, I can tell you from experience. And that, on the left-hand side, all stacked up there are portraits of the Medici and their favorite people. On the horse in front, the young man is Lorenzo. In his maturity, I mean, he's 55, a young man to me, but in his maturity, he really hits his stride and starts producing Filippo Lippi some of the greatest pictures. So we know why Botticelli wanted to go and study with him. And for a short time, maybe 2 weeks, Aaron de Graft and I were under the delusion we were going to get this loan granted to bring it here And it's at times like that we say soberly to each other, but are we mad? To have the responsibility to have simply one of the world's most beloved images. So fortunately, saner heads prevailed. They said, we can't learn that painting ever. We have this wonderful picture, which is typical of his late style, which is a little less lifelike. He swings over towards the Mausolino part of his foundation, and it's a little bit more imaginary, but it sure makes a great impression when you look at it down the corridor in the exhibition. And these are the pictures that he's making at the time that Botticelli is in his workshop. Now, I showed this to you last week, but it was so popular, I kept this slide. So you can see the drape effect again. And this is the early Botticelli we have in our show, and it's wonderful to compare them. One of the chief differences is Mary in the Botticelli has the face that when you see it on the streets of Florence as you're walking there, and you say, oh, she looks like a Botticelli. This is a very common phenomenon still today in Florence, and that's the face so many young ladies in Florence have. So he's closer to nature. He looks back to an earlier phase of his master. Now, the stance of the child is rather interesting. I never saw a child standing like that, like he's climbing up, or get up on Mary's shoulders. It's actually this Roman, classical Roman stance that we see in this picture by Playuolo. After he leaves his master, or his master leaves him, he goes off to paint frescoes in remote Spoleto. He spends a time, might be up to 2 years, working closely with the Playuolo brothers, Antonio and his brother Piero. So they start out friends, but then they turn up enemies because Botticelli steals a job from them. You know, and then the old "we're no longer speaking" follows. He was impractical sometimes in this way. From the Playuolo, he learned both look at antiquity for good poses, and he also learned, you know, your master, Fra Filippo Lippi, never took an anatomical lesson, as you never did. And look what you can do when you know anatomy. See how good this is on demonstrating the proper action of joints. Unfortunately, that's sort of where the Playuolo's art, you know, dimension ends. Proper use of joints, semaphores, whatever, and the stances. And what Botticelli took from his master was this wonderful warmth, intimacy, like real people, lifelike gestures, begins with the concept of mother and child and proceeds to Mary and Joseph. Filippo Lippi had it, and Botticelli was very sensitive to it. Now, we've come to the point where there's a little quiz in our program. Here we have 3 paintings out of 7 that were done for the Merchants Guild, and they were all supposed to be done by Piero del Playuolo, but Botticelli managed to steal the commission to do one of them. So, put up your hands when I tell you which one I'm thinking of, if you think that is the one by Botticelli. And I hope that after all these hours of lectures I've given you, this is a rhetorical question. Because it's obviously the one all the way down on the right end. Am I right? Raise your hand if you think that's the Botticelli. The one in the middle? Or this one near me? Yeah, even if it weren't, I would say it must now. He altogether, you know, there's sort of an eternal life. There's some thinking behind the eyes, and more robust in the limbs and the action of the knees. And this is, he's trying to fit in. He's trying to fit in with those works by the Playuolo. This is going to show some of the artists he had to contend with he's now beginning his career, and it's around 70. Fra Filippo Lippi has died. He introduced Botticelli to the Medici, but he wasn't working for them yet. And he had to contend with, the leading artist in the city was the sculptor, painter, Verrocchio. And Verrocchio really had that perspective angle down pat, didn't he? Ooh, look at that rush into the distance there, the archaic accuracy of the broken down building behind her. It's really a terrific picture, not especially warm, because Verrocchio is not really known for his warmth. And Verrocchio also was a very clever manager. He just had picked up this young apprentice who within months was his director of painting, and that was Leonardo from a town called Vinci. Before I get to that, look where Botticelli takes his studies after he gets Medici patronage. Here is a story, and my word is, 20 books with radically differing interpretations on what this painting means. Whereas, in fact, it is a completely straightforward explication of the Platonic theory that the moving power in the world is love, and that's Venus in the middle, and Venus embodies love, and there's two kinds of love. On the right-hand side, we have love that makes the world go round in the sense of propagating our species, and on the left-hand side, these are the three graces who are always thinking very elevated thoughts, so much so they don't need coats. And they are dancing to this divine harmony. And Mercury, who's in charge of change, he's stirring up the clouds and communicating these deep divine thoughts up to the celestial sphere, is where it will all start over again and come down. Now, the reason that this stuff made a good friar like Savonarola sick to his stomach is here is the entire story of creation, and we left out that thing sin. Oh, no sin, no redemption. So this was major league heretical, unfortunately. And a lot of trouble ensues. I don't have time to get into it, but they do start throwing things on bonfires, and then when Savonarola is excommunicated, he is found guilty of crimes, executed, and he's thrown on a bonfire. And this affects our subject tonight, Botticelli, as I'll show you. Back to the golden age, because 76 is the absolute golden moment for poetry and philosophy at the court of Lorenzo. We have this painting down in the book, and she could step out of this painting, and she's got real pure gold highlights all over her painting and her hair, and it's a very, very precious work to have on the cover of I don't know how many books, not fewer than 10. The Playuolo took their anatomy and what did I say? They looked at anatomy and they looked at antiquity, and they started doing geometric patterns also. So this is a wonderful example. Here you have this triangle, and the saint is at the apex of it. But this direction, they weren't friends of geometry. Botticelli did not follow. Right in the middle of this decade, there's Verrocchio does his best work, and many people think it is a portrait of the young Leonardo da Vinci. And I strongly suspect, to tell you the truth, it's by Leonardo da Vinci in Verrocchio's workshop, because it's so animated and lively and intelligent, more than any other work that Verrocchio ever did. It's rather a sensational, lively piece. They had many things in common. They had a similar theory of beauty, Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci here. They thought that beauty was found by looking at life, finding the most beautiful elements, and then composing with some refinement a beautiful figure in this way. By contrast, those who saw the Leonardo show, they saw those Michelangelo drawings. By contrast, Michelangelo said, beauty is in the mind of God, and in order to achieve it in your work, you have to be able to think like God, and I fortunately am able to. That had a lot of advantages, that theory, because then, of course, no one else could achieve beauty, since he was the sole possessor of the secret. Michelangelo was not a sharer. Did not play nice with other people. But he got along well with Botticelli, who was so much younger, actually a nice chap. Here is a painting that is by Verrocchio. Only the head of the angel is by Leonardo, has these gorgeous curls. And recently they did a technical analysis examining the pigments, and they think that the rather muscular, articulated chest of Christ here was painted by Leonardo later on top of what Verrocchio had done originally. Quite a picture. Show you the whole picture intact. This is an ideal vision because, after all, it could not be the house of a humble carpenter. And this subject that shows such intimacy between the mother and child, no one ever painted this pose before or after this picture. The child has his hands on Mary's hands. This, in picture language, means he's guiding her. We know from the words written there that it's Isaiah's prophecy that a virgin shall conceive, and it leads to a description of the coming Messiah. So I suppose, interpreting in the broadest sense, the child is saying, pay close attention to this. I'm explicitly mentioned here. And so it does. Filippino Lippi was only a few years younger than Botticelli, and when his father died, he was with his father, in '69, he came to Florence and he worked with Botticelli for a couple of years. I mean, they really were close friends, the Lippi family and Botticelli. And at this time, around 1480, this is Filippino Lippi's greatest picture. Unfortunately, he paints for another 24 years, but if only this again and again. It's in this very historic ancient church called the Badia in Florence, and when you go into this dark and ancient church, there it is, this explosion of color and sweetness on the left-hand side. St. Bernard is writing something, and Mary, he has a vision, and Mary appears, and, corrects a spelling error or something. She definitely has her finger on his book, and the donor is lower right. And this is a marvelous picture by Filippino Lippi, who's more decorative than Botticelli. Botticelli, his most important public work during his lifetime was this fresco, which incredibly is in our show. It's movable, but it doesn't leave the church very often because the wall it was on was torn down in the mid-1500s, and they saved it. And they saved the other one he was looking at. They were made as a competition between these two leading artists in the year 1480, that's Ghirlandaio, and everyone agreed, Vasari tells us, that the winner of the competition was Botticelli, because frankly, St. Jerome's portrayal is a little ridiculous. It looks, I asked for no whipped cream and it was covered with it. Ghirlandaio is not great for deep thoughts, whereas Augustine's, this picture made him famous. And it's the reason he painted 3 paintings on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Augustine seems so intense and gripped by this vision that he's having. He's a spark, and Jerome got ahead of it. We have this wonderful picture, and I'll show it next to the birth of Venus a few years earlier, because it's interesting what he did when he repeated it. Whereas the birth of Venus is right after he comes back from the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and he's painted this sculpture, because there is a sculpture, even with the pose of the leg that isn't bearing the weight, like a well-known Roman model of Venus. The Medici owned one, so sometimes they call it the Venus de Medici. By contrast, this later one, because he did two, the other one is like the large painting, but the one we have is the latest of the three, and she actually seems to float there weightlessly, and she seems sinuous instead of heavy. Her hair is contained. It's not lavishly and sensually flying around, and you can see her expression a bit more. The point is that Venus embodies love, and love has two qualities. Remember, we saw that. There's sensual, natural love, and there's love of God. And she is thinking about this. And I was talking to a group from St. Bede's, and I was trying to tread lightly, lest anyone think we had a pin-up here. And they conferred with each other, and then the spokesman said to me, "To us, she looks like Eve." And I said, "That is exactly right. In fact, that is an ancient Christian tradition of thinking of Eve in terms of Venus, and I didn't put it in the stupid book, but it was exactly right, and I can't remember everything now. So there it is. They enjoyed it perfectly well. And who would turn down an apple from this stand? Of the same kind, the late 80s, is this wonderful crucifix, and on the label, I tell the source of it, which is St. Augustine, who says, first of all, he points out, it says clearly in Genesis that God made man in his own image. That means we're all pretty good looking. Who are we to go against Scripture? And he said, Augustine, God is beautiful. God is beautiful in entering this life, in taking leave of this life. God is beautiful on the cross, he says, in the tomb, and in heaven. So that is the essence of God. Beautiful, not the trauma he suffered in the Passion. Well, this had an immediate effect on a young artist just getting started. This is a sculpted, polychrome wooden sculpture by Michelangelo, and that is how I was able to understand the Botticelli, because I had needed to do this reading of St. Augustine in order to understand this beautiful cross, which is returned from the museum to the church where it was originally, Santo Spirito. It's in a beautiful Renaissance sacristy, and shortly after it was transferred, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in the sacristy admiring it, and the prior of the Santo Spirito convent went by me and said to me, "È molto Augustiniano." It is very Augustinian. And with my usual habitual humility, I said, "Lo so, Padre." I know, Father. I should have said something different, but at any rate, I was pleased to have this confirmation that an Augustinian, I neglected to say, Santo Spirito is an Augustinian convent, thinks not showing the trauma is Augustinian. This is on the eve, we're ending the talk now, this is on the eve of his late style, 89, and it's a curious thing about it. This is really one of his most beloved paintings in the Uffizi, so dance-like, their movements, but as early as 1907, in the first great book about Botticelli, oh look, I can just point to the folds, pointed out that these sort of day-glow folds with these, and in the blue and her, they're not very realistic, and they're not, don't really resemble fabrics. They probably are by the hand of an assistant, and yet no one cares. That is important to bear in mind because these artists have contracts with their apprentices that teach them to paint and for things like that. You know, someone got their start. When we like the picture, this is the art historical approach to cataloging these works. When we like the picture, we say Botticelli. When we don't like the picture, we say workshop of Botticelli. No matter how exactly the same the handling is. Filippino Lippi did us the favor in this picture of painting his great patron, meaning Botticelli's great patron, whose name, he was a cousin of Lorenzo Magnifico, and he was also named Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco. And he had a brother named Giovanni, who had a very glamorous life, wrote off. That would be a story in itself, and he was very good looking. The brothers are shown here, extreme left, as magi. Lorenzo was holding a perfume jar, and in red, his much more handsome brother Giovanni, the adventurer, is being crowned with something. And I think this is probably their father below, but we don't have a positive identification on that. So here is the Medici tradition of having them portrayed as the Magi. Now, a few last words about the late style, which is featured in the last room of our exhibition. This is the first exhibition ever to dedicate a separate room to his late works. Because there's always been some confusion, and most of the works in the room currently are excluded from his work because they don't seem to be like him. He's renounced all those wonderful devices he learned, Botticelli, about how to make things beautiful. This is him on the left. The figures are flat, they overlap, the colors are not very subtle. There's no flaunting of gold anymore, but it's deeply touching and moving and kind of poetic. Look at the parallel arms there, like using rhymes in a poem, and how Mary Magdalene holding Christ's feet, her head is at this unnatural angle, and the chap behind, who might be Nicodemus, he holds the crown of thorns, and he holds it up in a way that you can see it's a circle. From a wonderful painting by Fra Angelica, we know that when you do that, and on the other hand you show something about compass or other, you're saying this was the divine plan, because circles are divine. And he got this late, spiky style, if you pardon the expression, from Gothic-looking works. They had lots of banking connections, and so lots of northern art came down. And so you see that by this, the master of Flemal, who we know his name is Robert Campen, this weightlessness of a style is something they were doing. And his friend, Michelangelo, who was in Rome for an Augustinian church, started painting a picture that's a kind of reminiscence of Botticelli, which was in a prominent church in Florence, so surely saw it. And rather wonderfully, we have a letter of 96 from Michelangelo in Rome, writing to Botticelli, giving him his regards and asking him if he would do him the favor of taking the letter that was enclosed to their common patron, who was that chap, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, I showed you a moment ago. And although the books say that, most of the books say there is no late style of Botticelli, and then they add, and if he had one, it wouldn't have been influential on anyone because everyone went a different direction. But it was influential on Michelangelo, and Michelangelo was influential on his great pupil, Intormo, in this terrific church that enjoys the distinction of being my wife's favorite painting in the world. No, that's based on broad experience. Mind you, that great mature mother, love-hate is the key thing. Thank you very much for your attention and bearing up with me.